Today, I want to welcome Sriram Mangudi. He is the principal consultant at Consult MSG, which I'm assuming is not monosodium glutamate. We'll figure out what that is. He brings over 25 years of global HR leadership across Fortune 500 industrial, pharmaceutical, and consumer companies. He partners with executives and investors to assess leadership and organizational risk, align talent and culture, and to drive enterprise value. Well, that is good medicine for everybody. Sriram, welcome.
Thank you, Craig. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I'm glad we were having such an amazing conversation in the green room. And I mean, first off, you're from India. And where in India are you from?
So I'm from a town called Hyderabad, which, funnily enough, has another town by the same name in Pakistan. So, yeah, but I'm from southern India.
Wow. And one of the things, and this was the reason I asked, it was like, in the US, we have a lot of towns named after British cities. I grew up in Cambridge, Maryland. There's a Cambridge, Massachusetts, of course. There's a Cambridge, Ohio. There's a handful of Cambridges. But I was wondering, I was just kind of curious, how does it feel for Indians to have a parallel town in Pakistan called Hyderabad, and how does it feel for Pakistanis to have one in? Is there any type of ownership of, hey, that's our town's name?
Well, I think, first of all, Hyderabad in both these countries were one at one point in time, especially under the British Empire back in the day. And, we share a long common history. And of course, the Arabs and Mughals, as they're known, were there in India many centuries before the British got to India. So I think it's a great reminder of the roots that we share across different parts of the world and how we all come together, have differences, fight with each other often, and but yet we create beautiful places, and both the Hyderabad's are really incredible places, and I've absolutely enjoyed learning as much about Hyderabad, Pakistan as I have about. I actually have a colleague. Um, in my company, Consult MSG. MSG, by the way, stands for Management Strategy and Growth. And my partner is from Pakistan, and it's been just wonderful knowing someone else, and never worked with a Pakistani across my career. So it's a fun discovery.
Well, and one of the things I've heard is that for many years, there's just been a lot of conflict between Pakistan and India. And, just bitter. I mean, a lot, not just conflict, but, war. And that border up there has just been rough.
Yep, it's been rough. I mean, and we fought in '71. We fought in uh, back as late as recent as 2008, and yeah, but there's also a lot of fun that brings these countries together. We play a ton of cricket, and people across both nations love the athletes and the sports men across both sides of the border, and idolize them. In fact, Prime Minister of Pakistan is still regarded as a boyhood hero for most and women in India, especially, because he's a really dashing cricketer. So I think, yeah, there's conflict, and then at the same time, because of the roots that we share, people have also found ways, and so it is an uneasy tension. And I just wish we'd put more of the conflict away and be nicer to each other.
Yeah. Well, and it's challenging. I mean, here in the United States, we had our own Civil War, and there's still you get in certain parts of the South, and there's still a lot of tension left over from the war. I grew up in the North. My wife is from Texas, and it was funny, just as recently as Christmas, my brother-in-law was using the term Yankee, which, I've got thick skin. I can take it, but I've lived in the South my entire adult life, and usually when I hear that phrase, it's not in a warm and friendly way. And she actually said, "Hey, that's kind of offensive to him when you use that term," and he had no idea.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and yeah, we call sometimes people by certain names, and even in India, you would have North Indians, a person from North India called someone from the South, and we have so India has more than 30 states, and yet for some time a lot of people in the North, everyone will go by a particular expression, and they're like they wouldn't distinguish, one state from another when referring to a person and kind of commonly club them in just one lump. Like we can very often do and say, well, this is the third world. Well, what is the third world? And or this is an emerging market. What is an emerging market? And or this is a good leader and a bad leader. And these are labels that, I think influence people's identities, but I think we need to be able to peel the onion a lot more and really get to know people a lot better to know what they're really made of and how we can work together.
Yeah. Well, and it's, one of the things we were talking about, and I think it's amazing. Let me just kind of pause here and say it's amazing that you, you're able to, you have this Pakistani colleague, and, at least in the green room, you were talking about how you guys really team up and work powerfully together.
Yeah, yeah. Consult MSG has, so my partner not only helps in advancing the firm, he runs a very large supply chain practice, but he runs one of the world's largest macronutrient programs through his foundation for prenatal children, moms. And this impacts almost 2 million women in Pakistan. And that's being partnered through one of America's largest foundations, Bill Gates Foundation, that I know of. So that's collaboration for you. The last I knew, he was actually in China helping the US ambassador negotiate chip advancement technology between China and the United States. So to me, people from different countries and backgrounds, and
Yeah.
I think that speaks to how we can, embrace cultures, embrace a geography, and embrace a location, embrace a company, and embrace values that a company has to make it work and add value to the entire workforce. That I think is what our job allows us to do.
Well, and one of the things that I think about, when I look at assuming somebody's company is attracting type A, highly competitive talent, when you get enough competitive people into a room, there's going to be conflict. And, I always marvel at, the Chicago Bulls when it was Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman.
Hmm.
And I mean, I'd love to spend a few hours with Phil Jackson to figure out how he got them to get along.
Uh, I don't know if we'd ever find out. That has got to be one of the world's greatest mysteries, right? It's an incredible combination of talent and completely different personalities. Yeah, that'd be something. Yeah.
But wouldn't you say that at some level, every company, that's fundamentally a challenge that every company has is you're bringing together, hopefully you're bringing together top talent, and top talent is often opinionated and maybe has a few rough edges that creates conflict.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. When we work with leadership, whether it's a CEO, CFO, especially private equities where patience runs thin pretty quick, I think it's kind of fascinating to understand and help people not judge the person or their identity, but focus on the expertise, their understanding of business, or a diversity of perspective that they can bring, because that is what helps companies change on their feet in the face of disruption. Your competitor is eating away with you through new technology. Your competitor is eating away at you in a new market that you haven't tapped. Your competitor is working away on developing a service model in a B2B business that you haven't dreamt of. It's going to hurt you if you're not going to be able to find out how to kind of get some of those things to work, through very diverse talent that come from different perspectives, different companies, different experiences. If you can't bring that to the table, you're essentially not just stagnating, but you're actually degrowing because you're having what I would call the value debt deficit that can hurt your enterprise.
Well, and if we jump back to the Chicago Bulls analogy, imagine the tragedy it would be to hire all that great talent. Every one of those was expensive. and bring them together and have them clashing as opposed to working together and being a multi-championship team.
Yeah. And that's it's pretty fascinating in the sense that I don't know if the Chicago Bulls were a runaway success from day one, and that Rodman was actually, pumping fists and, doing chest bumps with, Scottie Pippen, from the get-go. I think they must have gone through a lot of conflict, a lot of locker room fights or arguments, and all the stuff you don't get to see when you see the ring on their finger or the championship in their hands. But I think it is those moments. It's what you do and what is the quality of dialogue and space you give, incredibly talented people in a room that allows organizations to thrive. That to me is the secret sauce that you don't get to see on the court.
Yeah. So when you come into a company, what sort of challenges are you running into?
Um, I'll pick a challenge. I mean, I remember my first HR M&A roadshow. I was sent off to a remote town in, between Illinois and Iowa. We had just acquired, the company I worked for had just acquired $100 million business, and my flight was late. I was to meet the founder, owner, and his leadership team of the business that had just been sold, been bought by us, and to develop a people and process policy roadmap for integration with our company. And and so I walk in there, people have just had lunch, and I'm thrown into a room in which everyone's sitting on the third row. They've left the first two rows empty in a large conference room. And first question I get from the founder is, why am I there? And who sent me? And there was pin drop silence across the room. And I also had his successor who was going to take over the business because he'd agreed to stay with the business for about a year and help with the transition and so on. No one said a word. And I had a colleague with me who had driven along with me. It was his first, it was barely a year into his job, 2 years out of college. And before anyone could say anything, I picked up a marker pen and went up to the whiteboard and started to draw out what I thought were going to be the issues that we were going to spend the next couple of hours discussing. And I it broke the ice a bit because I said, well, here to talk about the integration. We've brought two great companies together, and there are things we have to work through to make this work. But he said, well, I don't want to talk about anything of that stuff you wrote on the board. So I put my pen aside and asked him what he wanted, and through the course of the next 3 to 4 hours, I was able to win his conference because his biggest fear was not what I had to discuss. It was what were we as a new company going to allow and ensure was going to be protected in this company that he built for the last 30 years. So, and I remember going out to dinner in the evening. It was a town of windmills. I'd never seen windmills as many as I did in this part of the country, but we clinked a glass of wine, and that told me that we'd broken the ice. And, from a time when, he was really suspicious about what the agenda was and what did change mean. Yeah, we integrated that business. It was one of the most successful businesses we integrated, profitable, brings a lot of money still. But it taught me the value of listening and also, collaborating and co-creating versus, coming with an agenda and then trying to shove it down someone's throat.
Yeah, and as you were telling that story, I heard you give them two gifts in particular. The first gift was the gift of listening. Yeah, there's just so much tension arises when people don't feel heard. The second gift that I heard you give them was autonomy. The I remember, back during the pandemic after people had been locked down for about a year, I saw some behavior that I thought was strange, especially down here in Texas. And I realized people had just lost their autonomy for too long. And so they were acting out. They were acting out, kind of like little kids. In many ways, we're little kids in adult bodies. But the two gifts I heard you give him were the gift of listening and the gift of autonomy, where he could go in and change that agenda and then feel heard on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would imagine that can be I would imagine that could be challenging for a lot of leaders because when you know you have a direction that you want to go, you see the path forward. In some ways, that must feel like a diversion. It must feel like the long path to getting to where you want to be.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, and I think leadership evolves, and I think being able to invest in leadership at different phases of your business is qualitatively different. You know, what you do at the time you've recently acquired a business towards a time when the business is growing and there was a lot of transformation needed in systems, products, introducing new platforms, and so on. I think it's it's that's the point where the character of leadership truly shows up, and that's where CEOs can play such an incredible role in helping a team, integrate, coalesce in a time when it could just appear that, can I just survive one more day through so much change? And that's, I think, the fascinating part of working with enterprises that are growing or growing inorganically, especially. I mean, it's one thing to be doing and making the same product for over 100 years and not have too much change in your business. But it's another thing altogether to bring businesses together from different countries, businesses together from different parts of the country, different businesses that bring B2B and services together. The fun of, forging a leadership team that lasts through that change and seeing it through, I think, is a pretty challenging task. But again, it comes down to, how much the leadership is willing to invest in that level of governance. I remember you mentioned COVID. One of my most defining experiences from a leadership standpoint was when, on the day that we had a complete shutdown declared, I believe it was March 23rd, 2020, when I was back in India. I had to go back because my dad was ailing and, I lost him a couple of years ago. I remember that, I was the CHR for a mid-sized pharmaceutical firm, and my CEO asked me and reminded me, said, I hope you know that we're part of essential services. And what it was not just a question, it was a defining moment that asked me, do you really know what it takes to run a workforce 24 bar 7 across three factories, serving the US and European markets, life-saving medicines in real time across R&D, manufacturing, quality? I remember never having been thrust into something so out of the open where on a daily basis I had to tee up, shift patterns, attendance patterns, diagnostic screening patterns, primary contact and secondary contacts from pandemic infections, hospitalizations, people stuck in remote locations because they'd been, quarantined for a certain period of time, and making it all work on a weekly, daily, monthly basis through mass vaccination campaigns for full-time and contract workforces. That taught me the wisdom that you could be the glue when all about you are losing their heads. So I think, to me, it's how do you bring calm to a situation when there's a lot of gray, there's a lot of ambiguity, and you have to force, some method to the madness. I think those are the kind of qualities we look for in leaders and help leaders build.
And I think that's a phenomenally good point. And kind of back in the pandemic, there were a lot of people that were freaking out. And, it's interesting because I can think of two examples, two people that I know that were both in the business of putting people on physical stages. One was a keynote speaker that was launching his career as a keynote speaker. He'd been very, very successful in his industry and was very well known, had a enviable Rolodex. And the other was somebody who had a business that equips people to get on stages and speak from stages to make their money. And the second one, when the pandemic hit, he didn't lose his cool. He basically pulled the team together for 3 days and said, Okay, our number one, our conference, our number one moneymaker for the year in 2 or 3 months, it's not happening. What do we do? And within 3 days, he completely pivoted the company and had the highest revenue year of his company's history, where his revenue was based on putting people on stages. He made more money during the pandemic than he had any year prior to that when nobody was going on stages. The other one, the keynote speaker that had the enviable Rolodex, I talked to him a little bit towards the end of the pandemic, and he was sitting there and just moaning. I think it was like a Friday night or something we were talking, and he was telling me about how horrible life had been because he had launched his career as a keynote speaker, and he was just left able to do nothing for like 2 years. And I'm thinking, with your Rolodex, you couldn't find a way to add value. But that's that clarity that you're talking about when chaos hits, having a leader who can say, okay, the world's just changed. No worries. We will work through it. Let's work the problem.
Absolutely. And it's that ability to adapt and be agile in the moment versus, well, this is the way we used to do it in the past, or this is the only way in which we can solve this problem. I think people who are going to be stuck with those kinds of frames of reference are going to struggle when, like you said, you have your context changing before your very eyes. The ground on which you're standing is no longer the same, and the medium with which you communicate is no longer the same. The way in which people give you your output is changing through AI. So I think, yeah, those are great. All of these experiences, if anything, also taught me at the same time my biggest realization. I'll share one more story about COVID. Right, the biggest learning was year one of COVID. We're dealing with who's in hospital, how many people are sick today, how many people didn't get screened yesterday, how many people did not take the vaccination. Year two, my chief medical officer called me and he said, Sriram, I'm going to do one thing. I said, what? He said, I'm going to go after people with comorbidities. And I said, what do you mean comorbidities? And he said, well, anyone that has a high risk predisposition, hypertension, sugar, um, cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, any one of them from our annual medical checkups. And we had to do annual medical checkups by the FDA norm, mandated by law for every single person on our premises. And he said, I'm not going to bother about vaccinations. We'll get all of that done. But the most important thing is preventive health. And that was the first time that I realized whether it's solving leadership issues, whether it is solving a workforce productivity, it is knowing what causes things long term in the first place versus dealing with the symptoms that you can, make a big deal of change and drive value that's sustainable versus doing a quick fix.
Yeah. No, and that's so powerful. That's so powerful. Well, hey, as we wrap up, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, how do we develop these leaders? How do we develop these leaders that can have walk into chaos and bring order?
One of the things we focus on, Craig, is it's very common in private equity, especially the first 6 to 18 months of an acquisition or a deal or an add-on platform for the P sponsor to replace the CEO or the CFO or controller in finance. We're peeling away at that a bit because what we're seeing is that that is setting back the portfolio company in private equity usually at least 6 to 12 months because one, you have a new leader on board. Two, the expectations have changed because 6 months into an acquisition, tables are very different from what they were at the start of the acquisition. Two, you have a new matrix of relationships that is very different from, the environments that a lot of these leaders have worked with. A lot of the leaders in private equity actually come from publicly listed, companies that because there's such a paucity of leadership talent in the market. And what we've realized is that by working a strong governance model and developing a strong business focused, business aligned success profile for your CFO, for your chief revenue officer, your CEO, but most importantly, establishing transparent governance and dialogue between the P sponsors, the CEO, and the C-suite of the portfolio leadership on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis can help, reduce attrition in private equity, privately owned companies by at least 50%. Because
Wow.
right now, it's upwards of 50, 60% in that space within the first 12 to 18 months of any PE acquisition of a portfolio company. So I think we have to get away, solving problems and helping leaders, be more stable and add more value by their presence versus looking to replace leaders as the first sign of pressure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's certainly, I mean, going through, I mean, I've been through an M&A and it's
How fascinating.
yeah, it's challenging. I think I lasted maybe 3 months or so. It I brought my they paid out the first tranche of retention bonuses in advance, hoping that we'd buy something nice. Fortunately, I didn't buy anything nice, and I walked back into my boss's office and slid the check across the table and said, "I just can't do this." But that's hard because there's a lot of churn during an M&A, and not everybody will stay. And it's figuring out how to drive the integration and motivate those who will stay.
Yeah, and most integrations usually, especially at the time of the acquisition, the transition stage, spend very little time with the leaders who are being impacted. Everything is on how much money can we extract? Can we grow the business 3x? Can we introduce two new products? And no one's really talking to the person that's going to be able to enable all of that. No one's talking to the CFO as to what he's thinking about when he goes back home in the night. What's he going to tell his kids about how long he's going to be in that job? Is he worried about it? And so on. And very rarely is the CHRO or the head of HR actually engaged in the discussions. Usually, HR is a very late entrant to the whole thing. It's usually at a wrap up point from an acquisition standpoint that a lot of this then is pretty tough to address so late in the day.
Yeah, I bet. Well, Sriram, this has been really interesting. Yeah, it's very fascinating. And thank you for coming on Layers and Legacies. How can people reach you?
I'm very active on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn profile is Sriram Mangudi. That's Sriram, my first name, and my last name is Mangudi. Also, my email is Sriram Mangudi, my first name, last name at gmail.com. I'd love to hear from your listeners.
All right. Well, thanks again for coming on Layers and Legacies.
Thank you so much, Craig.